So yeah, as you know, there'll be two elements to the kind of competitive part of the day. First of all, you'll be giving presentations based on the videos you submitted for us. We're going to be asking you to summarize your argument in 1 minute. So that's not a lot of time. So it's really important to kind of make sure you distill the argument you gave us into the kind of central, most important points. In that part of the competition, you're also going to be asked to give a question to another team. So you, I think, should have been allocated the other team and should have been able to find their video by now. The idea here is not that you're looking for a question where you can kind of catch them out or kind of really show what's gone wrong with their argument. We're looking for this to be quite a kind of constructive exchange. So the thought is that you might try and come up with a question or a kind of point which would develop or improve their argument rather than kind of totally undermining or destroying it or something like that. And so, yeah, as I say, the main purpose of this round, presentation round, is to kind of really just take a step back and think about the argument that you sent us. And to kind of expand on and amend it in response to challenges that might come from one of the other teams or from the judges. So the judges will be asking you questions as well. So you shouldn't be kind of afraid at this point to, maybe make slight changes to the argument. You might think in response to a question that actually maybe we should have said this thing instead, and that's absolutely fine. When it comes then to the second round, so that first round will decide who's going to go into the kind of first and second place debate and who's going to go into the third and fourth place debate. So when it comes to the second round, I think Liz has sent you the kind of breakdown of how long you'll have for each speaker. So there'll be 3 of you speaking in the debate round. Obviously, you can choose which of you is speaking if there are more than 3 people in your team, and you can choose who goes in what position. In terms of thinking about who's going to speak and who's going to speak in what position, first, second, or third, you might want to think a little bit about, what kind of strengths and weaknesses different members of your team have, because those different speaker roles, do slightly different things. So speaker 1 is obviously outlining your initial case, either for the motion or against the motion. So that person can be, unlike the second and third speakers, they can be kind of pre-scripted in a way, right? They can have done the most preparation, I guess, because speakers 2 and 3 are going to be much more responsive to what the other team has said. So if there's someone who's maybe a bit less confident in kind of making things up on the fly or in improvising or in kind of thinking on their feet, that's a person who might want to go in the speaker 1 position. Correspondingly, speaker 3 is going to be doing quite a lot of summarizing, right? So they won't be introducing that much in terms of a new argument. So again, that's kind of something worth thinking about. And speaker 2 kind of has probably the role where there's the most new argument being developed in response to the other team. You are welcome in both rounds to bring in notes, but we're going to ask that you just bring in either written out notes or printed notes, not that you're reading from an electronic device, right? Because we want to avoid any kind of possibility of people Googling things as the debate is going on, right? So you should have done all your preparation before the debate. So notes are fine, but they need to be printed out. I'd advise against, bearing that in mind, I'd advise against speaker 1 having a pre-prepared script that they just read out to the audience. The reason being that can kind of cause problems with your delivery, right? It can be kind of awkward if you're staring at a piece of paper and just reading that out. It's better to have some notes that are going to kind of inform what you say rather than just read us out something. In terms of how the debate should go and in terms of how your questions to other teams should go, I'm sure this goes without saying, it always does when we run this competition, but I think it's still worth saying. You should obviously be respectful to each other. You shouldn't be launching attacks on kind of individuals, but you should be just thinking about the content of the argument that's being presented by the opposing team. Another thing to bear in mind is some of you may have done debating before, some of you may have done lots of debating before, and some of you may have done no debating before. So if you're someone who's done lots of debating before, just bear in mind that is an advantage that you have over people who have done none before, both in terms of preparation and confidence. And your job in this debate is not to kind of humiliate the other team or kind of totally absolutely annihilate them. It's to just persuade the judges that your argument is stronger than theirs, right? So the point of the debate is to show us and to develop your skills in outlining an argument. So, bearing in mind where you're all at in your academic careers, we're not expecting a totally groundbreaking new argument that none of us have ever heard before, right? Because these are topics that the judges will know well as professional ethicists. So we're not expecting you to kind of totally surprise us with what you come up with. And we're not expecting a completely flawless argument, right? We know that, you may make mistakes, you may kind of get things a bit wrong, you may not make a perfect argument. What we're looking for is original, interesting points being made for your career level. And we're also looking at the clarity of your argument and how persuasive it is and how well it fits together. That's how well it fits together for each speaker individually, but also across the three speakers, right? So you've got to bear in mind when you're thinking about preparing for your debates, that what you'll be doing is trying to persuade us across the three speakers. So what you say across those three speakers should be consistent, right? You shouldn't be contradicting each other, but it also should be clear how your argument is developing across the three speakers. Try to speak clearly and at a measured pace, right? So sometimes people think that the best thing to do is try and get as much information as possible into their allotted time for speaking, and kind of overwhelm us with how much you know or how much you can kind of point out. That's not the way to go on these things, right? So we'd much rather have you make a few really good points and develop them in detail than kind of scattergun us with loads and loads of points, but not really develop them. And that also applies for speakers 2 and 3 to how you rebut some of the other team's points, right? So you don't have to pick up on every single point they make. Really, the key thing here is to try and identify what you think are the strongest arguments they're making and show where you think the problems lie there. Part of doing that is going to be, so we sometimes make this distinction in philosophy between straw manning and steel manning, right? So straw manning is where you kind of interpret your opponent's argument in a kind of quite uncharitable way. So you kind of say, you kind of imagine that they're making a very implausible argument and then proceed to show why that argument isn't persuasive. Now, that's not very impressive, right? To show that a bad argument is unpersuasive is quite easy. And the judges will probably spot it if you do that. So the better thing to do, if you can, is to steel man. And what that means is you take the other team's argument and you say, look, here's the most plausible version of what they're saying. Here's the version of what they're saying, which would be most difficult for us. And here's still why we think it doesn't succeed. So that's much more impressive because you're showing why your argument is better than a very strong argument, rather than why your argument is better than a very bad argument or weak argument. When you're presenting us with information, you should bear in mind that this is an ethics competition. So, factual information is obviously important and relevant, and you're perfectly, fine to bring in lots of empirical facts. But really what we're most interested in is your ethical argument. So those facts should always be very clearly relevant to the ethical argument. And you shouldn't assume too much that it's obvious how some empirical fact is relevant to the ethical conclusion that you're trying to argue for, right? You should be quite explicit about how you think those things are linked. And that applies as well to when you're making individual ethical points. You should be thinking really, am I being as clear as I can be about how all this builds towards the conclusion that we're trying to argue for? When you're preparing for the debates, make sure that you're thinking about how to answer the question or the position that you're actually going to be given rather than one you hope to be given, right? So don't try and kind of interpret the topics in a way that you think you would find easier to argue around, right? Because again, the judges are going to spot if you do that. So you really have to think, what is the kind of most obvious interpretation of what's being said here and how can we successfully argue around that point? You may well have thought of this already, but we suggest, particularly for speaker 1, that a good way to kind of practice is to kind of present to friends or family or teacher and ask them to kind of spot problems or kind of ask you challenging questions. And that's it in terms of what I had to say about kind of tips about how to approach those 2 parts of the day. So I'll let you now, if you've got any questions, maybe the best thing, since there are quite a few people, is if you can either use the raise hand function on Zoom, or if you can't find that, just feel free to unmute and shout. And if multiple people try to speak at the same time, we'll work it out. So any questions from anyone?
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much. Just with regards to when we ask the question, is that just a singular sort of concise question, or is it a series of questions related to that question, like follow-up question sort of style?
So in the first presentation round, it'll just be the one question you'll be asking of the team that you've been assigned. In the debate rounds, we might sort of see, you might be able to ask a kind of follow-up question, because that will be, in a sense, an extension of the debate, right? So we'll kind of have a bit more flexibility there. But yeah, in terms of preparing your question for the other team when it comes to watching their video, it's just one question, and then it's more assessing how they are answering it really that we're interested in.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. Great. Anyone else? That's fine. If nobody has any other questions, you can, obviously, we're still got a kind of week and a half or so till the day, so you can always get in touch with me or with Liz if you do think of a question that you kind of wish you'd asked today. The only other thing I think, Liz, we were going to ask people was just about Dave Leal's session. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. So we've got options. So while the judges are deliberating, we've got Dave Leal, who's from the philosophy faculty, coming in to talk about studying philosophy at Oxford. And then we've got an optional trip across the road very quickly to go to the Bodleian to have a look at their treasure exhibition there. So we were just wondering to get a sense of numbers for Dave, and it's absolutely fine, you can change your minds and we're not going to hold anyone to it, but we're just wondering roughly how many people are planning to come to Dave's talk, and then we can let him know. So if you are coming to Dave's, if you just write Dave in the chat, and then we'll get a sense of the numbers. Thanks. That's great, thanks. It is also worth saying that the Bodleian exhibition is open to the public, so you're not missing an opportunity to go and see it. You can always go and see it later if you wanted to. That's brilliant. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, yeah, we just wanted to get a kind of rough sense of people who are coming. So that's great. Okay. Yeah, so if there aren't any more questions, and as I say, please do feel free to email me if you do think of something. I think we'll perhaps end it there. Thanks very much for joining us.
See you all in a couple of weeks.